Hello there, guys. Welcome. My name's Mohammed. I'm one of the RadCast co-founders, and welcome to part one of our clinical radiology applications overview for 2022-2023. Now, this is part one of four, and in each of the parts, we're going to be covering different sections of the application process. Okay, we've broken it down because when we actually did this live, it took over 2 hours, and I don't think anybody's got time to sit through 2 hours of me talking about the application process. So broken it down to make it very bite-sized, and of course get in touch with us if you have any questions, things don't make sense, and that's what we'll be covering in this talk. So as I mentioned, four parts, four main aspects of the application process. In this part of the series, we're going to be covering things that were similar to previous cycles, the major changes, which is pretty much one, and it was quite a big one when it came to the 2022-2023 application cycle. Then look at the application timeline for last year, because it gives you an indication of what type of dates you need to be getting ready for. Then the ranking process, how your final rank was calculated. And then last but not least, what people do get very fixated on, and it's understandable why, the competition ratios and our advice in terms of what we expect going forward for the future application cycles. So let's start. So in terms of what we're not covering, and I think it's important you're aware so you're not wasting your time watching this video expecting us to cover this stuff. Number one, we're not covering the Northern Ireland application process because that's a different application process entirely. Number two, the academic clinical fellowship, because that requires a lot more input because it's such a more thorough application that looks at your overall CV from obviously an academic perspective. Thirdly, the ST3 clinical radiology application, that is totally different from the ST1 in the sense that there's no MSRA. The interview is much more radiology orientated about what you've reported, the volume of scans, more radiology specific scenarios. And then of course why all other specialties hate on radiology, but that's a separate talk in its entirety. If you are a candidate that fits into one of the first three categories, if you're in the fourth, I don't know why you're watching this video, but if you're in the first three, then please do contact us at hello@radcast.co.uk. We will figure out what's going on, what specific scenario you're involved in, and then give you a lot more tailored advice relevant to you. Either you're applying for Northern Ireland, you're applying for the ACF, or you're thinking of applying for ST3. So yeah, get in touch with us. So let's start with things that were similar to previous years, because it will take a bit of the anxiety away in terms of what you are worried about when it comes to your application this year. So things that were similar were, number one, there was interventional radiology themed posts. Now I want to spend a few minutes on this particular point, because what we find is that candidates seem to get really fixated about an IR themed post. What does it mean? Well, basically, you're telling the deanery that, listen, TPD, head of school, I'm really keen on doing IR after ST3 when I've got through the core years. The training program then goes, okay, how many of you are in that category? Okay, we got 3. So that means as a minimum, we should anticipate that all 3 of these candidates will think of doing IR. So let's make sure that when it comes to their ST4 and above, their specialist kind of years of their training, let's make sure we have enough IR themed posts so that we can facilitate these trainees. It doesn't mean that if you go, you know what, I really don't want to do IR, I'd rather do pediatrics. They're going to be like, no, you signed the dotted line, that's it. You're now bound to us like Satan. It's not that you haven't made a contract with the devil, all right? You've just literally given an indication. Similarly, if you're like, well, RadCast, guys, I didn't get an IR theme post and I really want to do it, it's not the end of the world. They're not going to be like, no, you should have declared it. I'm sorry you weren't ranked high enough. It's just for job planning in sense of the deaneries trying to get an idea of how many IR themed tracks they need to kind of get ready for. At the end of the day, if you are inclined towards IR when you start, express your interest, and they will start to make amendments. Then they again idea, okay, we've got a few other candidates. Similarly, if you realize that IR is not for you, that's fine. You're not bound to any contracts or anything. Then they won't get annoyed with you either. But that's just a quick overview of these IR themed posts. Similarly, the interview format was virtual, similar to previous years. You didn't have to go to the RCR, which is a lovely building, very lovely, down in London. So you get to make a day of it. But you didn't have to. You could enjoy getting grilled by two radiologists in the comfort of your own home. And then in terms of the ranking process, the split between portfolio, interview, and MSRA was very similar, which we'll cover at a later point in this video. Let's now focus on the major changes to the application process. And honestly, it was all about one thing: portfolio, portfolio, portfolio. They removed points for intercalated degrees. They removed points for for having done the MRCP, the MRCS Part 1 or its entirety. Portfolio was the thing that caught a lot of candidates off guard, and understandably so, because it became a lot more detailed, the portfolio, in terms of what they were looking for. And they added domains like leadership and management domain. They totally revamped the research into specialty domain. The academic domain become much more radiology orientated, and they split teaching into two domains, two subdomains. We'll cover this in part 4. So if you want to just skip ahead, you can go ahead by all means. You'll see my ugly face there too, so you haven't got away from me. But if you want to go straight to portfolio, skip to part 4 of this series. But really, honestly, apart from the portfolio, every other component was very similar. It's just the portfolio really caught candidates off guard because of the major revamp in the 2022-2023 cycle. So let's now look at the recruitment timeline that candidates applying in 2022-2023 had to go through. So as per usual, November is when applications open on Oriel. Then you had to upload your self-assessments in February of the subsequent year. And interestingly, if you look at the MSRA window, you realize, wait a minute, in previous years, you submitted your application, you then uploaded your evidence, you then did the MSRA, and then got your interview, or like your verification score for your portfolio. This year, they did it a bit differently, and I'll explain what we think they were going for. So you applied on Oriel. If you were eligible, you then got invited to the MSRA. If you then got the cutoff score for the MSRA shortlisting, you were then and only then invited to upload your evidence for verification. So that means if you didn't meet the cutoff score for the MSRA, you never got that opportunity. Your application came to an end. It was only candidates who made it through the cutoff that were eligible. And that makes sense. Let's be honest. They invited 749 candidates in the 2022-2023 cycle to interview. That's a lot of candidates. Previous years, typically, like when it's been face-to-face, it's been around 600 odd. So 749 is a big jump, all right? And that's a lot of administrative work. So by doing it this way, they've kind of reduced the burden, because candidates who aren't shortlisted don't get a portfolio score. Then you have the interview. Last application cycle, it was in the first week of March, offers at the end of March, and then the training program started. Well, it's at the point of recording this video, it's going to start in August 2023. For those of you that went through the application cycle, you are aware that deadlines were missed, deadlines were changed. Unfortunately, that's part and parcel of the process. You just got to get through it. Like, it's annoying. I appreciate why you would be annoyed. I would be annoyed too, but it's just the game you're playing. You just got to take it on the chin, accept that it is what it is, and just keep enduring through the application process. I guarantee there is light at the end of the tunnel, okay? Just, you got to get through it. Now, when it came to the ranking process for radiology in the 2022-2023 cycle, it was similar for previous cycles. Basically, a third, 33% of your final rank came from your portfolio, your verified portfolio self-assessment, that is, your MSRA score, and your interview performance. Similar to previous years, the MSRA was used not only to shortlist you for interview. Basically, if you met the cutoff, you were invited to interview, and if you didn't, your application came to an end, basically rejected. But also it then contributed a third, 33% of your final rank. So the MSRA, once again, is pretty much one of the biggest hurdles you'll go through during this application cycle, because it's a double whammy. You need to do well to get shortlisted, and you need to do well to get a rank high enough to, number one, be deemed eligible for training. Basically, you've met the cutoff, and also be high enough that you get your training program, the one you want to go to and train in radiology. Now, this slide is often something that candidates love to really get into. And yes, it's good to be aware of the competition ratios, but ultimately, so what? It's going to be competitive, but does that mean you're not going to apply? I'm not really convinced that it should put off serious candidates. If you know you want to do radiology, then you know what, the competition ratio shouldn't put you off. You should just take and be like, okay, I need to put in the work because I'm competing, as was the case in the 2022-2023 cycle, 3,100 applicants approximately, all right? And you can see the jump from the 2021-2022 application cycle, which was 2,231. So it's jumped by approximately 900 odd candidates. Similarly, the number of posts, we're not sure of the final number of posts. And this number that we have of 332 is based upon multiple sources that we've come across. Some have said, it was 365. Some have said it was 350. We keep seeing this 332 number a lot more frequently. And when we've dug a bit deeper, we think there's now a new bottleneck appearing. And the bottleneck is not necessarily due to funding, which I'll come on to in a second. It's a bottleneck due to capacity in the existing training programs. You've got to remember, the training programs have a set number of consultants, and it takes approximately 5 years to get a new batch of consultants, because radiology is a 5-year training program. With that being said, if you start pumping training programs with candidate after candidate, then guess what? They won't get trained because they can't be trained. There's just not enough, literally physical capacity. You got to remember, every radiologist, registrar, whether it's an ST1 all the way up to ST5, and consultants, they need a workstation. If they don't have a workstation, what are they going to do? You can't look at images necessarily, all right? Unless you go old school and start looking at the light box, which I don't think is, I hope no training program is having to resort to. But at the end of the day, they need physical space to train the trainees. Similarly, the way radiology training works is that you're meant to get feedback from consultants. If there's 6 of you all trying to get plain films, you're going to struggle with numbers. So the bottleneck seems to be what we've heard emerging on the other side, where the training programs are now telling the recruitment leads, we're sorry, but we don't have much more space to take on increasing numbers. Yet the number of candidates applying is going up and up and up. All right. So there is now this growing mismatch in terms of capabilities of training programs to take on more trainees. So if you look at the competition ratio, and by the way, this is competition ratio pre-MSRA shortlisting. Last year, for the 2022-2023 cycle, they invited to interview 749 candidates. So the competition ratio, yes, does drop in terms of how many of you are competing with one another. But before MSRA, it's approximately 9.33. And you can see on the right side of your screen other specialties. And you may be thinking, well, why is it going up? What was this jump from 2018 where it was 970 and now it's 3,100? What happened? Well, medicine joined a workforce shortage list, basically meaning that in terms of recruitment and the criteria for eligibility to enter specialty recruitment, this put international medical graduates on equal footing to UK graduates, meaning that those who have trained abroad and are potentially working abroad, if they had the paperwork required, for example, the certificate of readiness to enter specialty training, the CREST, they had GMC registration, etc., etc. Basically, they were eligible. They could apply directly with UK graduates in the first round. All right. In previous iterations, before medicine was on the workforce shortage, it was that UK graduates would get initial preferential treatment in the initial rounds, and if there were still vacancies, this would then be opened up. Because medicine is now on the workforce shortage list, this means international medical graduates are on equal footing and they get equal dibs when it comes to the first round of recruitment for the specialties. It's not just radiology, it's all specialties. Now, with that being said, candidates often ask us, well, RadCast, what do you think's going to happen? Now, we don't have a crystal ball. If I did, the first thing I'd ask is, when is AI going to take all our jobs? All right, not just radiology. When can I expect to literally be out of any medical job and basically we're all outside enjoying life, or just basically getting shafted like Skynet and Terminator? That's the first thing I'd ask. But if you're asking for our prediction, well, basically, when we think of the future cycles, in particular the 2023-2024 cycle, because that's the one you're probably interested in, we think, number one, the number of candidates applying, we think may hit the 4,000 mark. And the reason for that is, number one, as I mentioned earlier on the video, the medicine being on the workforce shortage criteria that isn't set to change anytime soon. But secondly, due to things such as COVID, it really put a magnifying glass on radiology as a specialty and other more diagnostic specialties like histopathology too. And the reason why is because candidates and other doctors who are in more clinical facing specialties like medicine, surgery, A&E, general practice as well, they realize, wait a minute, like we're getting a really bad deal here. Like we're really getting the short end of the stick. Whereas your colleagues in radiology, histopathology were having a good time, work from home. The trainees were potentially getting reassigned to home where they could do home reporting. And kind of like, wait a minute, let me look into this because it seems like a sweet gig. Similarly, as you may have come across in one of our podcasts, Jamie has moved to Dubai where he's now doing teleradiology. This is a very unique element to radiology. Of course, it's in other diagnostic specialties like histopathology, but it's a lot more advanced and robust as a career path in radiology, once again attracting candidates. So all of this has really put a spotlight on radiology. Even things like AI, where I know every Tom, Dick and Harry is saying we're out of jobs, but fundamentally, it's still exposed radiology as specialty. So we think that number is going to potentially hit 4,000 this year. Similarly, one thing you need to be aware of is in previous years, several years ago, one of the things that happened was there was a workforce planning document made where they identified certain specialties that had recruitment issues to assign extra funding to. So for example, A&E, psychiatry, general practice, radiology was one of them. And they realized that, number one, we need to recruit more into these specialties because of their growing importance. Radiology, the reason, obviously, the number of scans being done is like the CT machine is on fire nowadays. Like at the end of the day, you need to have reporters. You can only do so much with skills mix and other entities like teleradiology. You need the core radiologists. So there was this agenda to get more trainees into these specialties. That extra funding was only set for 5 years. And the final year is the 2023-2024 application cycle, from what we know. We are not heard anything about whether this funding has been renewed, if it's changed, if it's less, is it more, is it zero? We haven't heard anything about this. So with that being said, and this is a big if, I'm not saying this is true, this is just speculative, but you should know, If this pot of funding does not get renewed, or it's not in the same amount, it's like potentially less, then this means they cannot increase the training numbers at the same rate. So whilst it's been going like this in terms of training numbers, it could start to plateau. So if you've got more candidates, less or reduced growth of training numbers, then it doesn't take a rocket scientist to do the maths. You're going to start to face increasing competition. And we think this is going to have a knock-on effect in terms of the MSRA. In the 2022-2023 cycle, core surgical trainees got absolutely shafted. All right, that's just me being very honest with you guys. Without any notice, bam, you have to do the MSRA. Everyone was in a bit of an uproar, rightly so, because it came out of nowhere. And consequently, you now had candidates who were sitting primarily for the core surgical training. But at the end of the day, if you're applying for core surgical training and you're like, well, now I have to do the MSRA, why don't I just throw in a radiology application too? Because it's the same exam. I'm going to have to do it anyway. So why don't I see what happens? At the end of the day, it's no skin off their back. They're not having to do anything extra. And often the portfolios overlap quite significantly between core surgical training and radiology. So you had now this additional pool of candidates who typically would not, like, you may think core surgical trainees really like hate themselves and expose themselves to like even more unnecessary pain, but it takes a lot of self-loathing to then go and do an extra exam for no reason relevant to your specialty. So now that MSRA was relevant to them, why not? It makes sense. See what happens. And that's added another pool of potential candidates to the MSRA exam, which we think pushed the cutoff score for radiology when it came to last year's application cycle. So in terms of wrapping up part one thing that we want to emphasize, and I'm going to be probably emphasizing this throughout every part of this series, you need to start preparing. Every point counts, all right? The fact that the competition ratio is jumping like there's no tomorrow, it's jumped by 3x from 2018, from like 3.44, I think it was, to like 9.33 in the 2022-2023 cycle. Means one thing: you need to be on your game, you need to be on your top form, because every point does count. So in terms of what we can do for you at RadCast, please just email us, hello@radcast.co.uk. We'll chat to you back, we'll give an email back, see where your application is at, give you personalized support and help you take your application to the next step. So that's part one of the overview of the 2022-2023 series. In part two, we'll be covering the absolutely loved multi-specialty recruitment assessment. So I'll see you guys on that video. Take care.